Okay, hello, Year 12. This is a video about an essay for Plato, a Plato essay. Um, it's very similar to a lesson that we went through, to stuff we went through in one of the lessons, but I'm aware that at least one person wasn't there for that lesson. So, considering the task I'm going to ask you to do, I thought I'd put it again on a video. Might be helpful for everyone. So, it's probably going to be quite short because I don't want to go through. I don't want to go through everything in massive detail. That will be You'll be able to use your notes to do that. So I asked you to write an essay plan for an Aristotle essay, and I want you to similarly write a plan with a conclusion for this essay. The simile of the cave tells us nothing about reality. Discuss. Now, in terms of general essays about Plato, you can generally get asked either about the simile of the cave or about the theory of the forms. And the secret is that the main content of your essay wants to be the same, really, for those two essay questions. Sometimes people, when they talk about the simile of the cave, sometimes people get stuck on writing about, is it a good simile? So you could look at that question and say the simile of the cave tells nothing about reality. So you could be like, well, is it a good way of representing Plato's theory? But that's not really what that question's asking. What it's asking is, are the ideas communicated by the simile of the cave true? Are they good ideas about reality? Do they make sense? Are they plausible? So whether you're asked an essay about is the simile of the cave correct or is the theory of forms correct, you're basically going to be writing about the same thing. So I'm going to quickly discuss in this video how you might go about doing stuff in an introduction, your disc introduction, then about what your perils might be, and then that'll be it, really. You'll need to write a conclusion of your own based on the ideas we're going to put. So let's go through it. So I'll just put all this stuff up. So key terms you need to explain. When you need to say briefly what the simile of the cave is, that it's a simile about, that it's linked to the theory of the forms. You don't need to go into that into detail because you'll talk in detail about these concepts in the perils, but you want to give a brief overview of the simile of the cave. Yes, that would be the main thing. Implications. What are the implications of simile being accurate? How would it change our lives? How would it change the way we organise society? So you want to talk about basically the simile is a simile for Plato's greatest theory about reality, and that is the theory of forms. There's massive implications if the theory of forms is correct, because it would mean that truth lies not in the world of the senses, the world of experiences, but in the world of forms, which is accessible through rationality, not through empirical evidence. But more perhaps practically, it would mean that Plato's ideas about who runs society would mean that we'd have to change the way we organise our societies. Plato was against democracy, the system of government that we have, and was an elitist. He wanted an educated elite of philosophers to run society. Scholars who are relevant, well, obviously Plato, the simile is found in the Republic. That's the book. The scholars you can talk about, there are some names that will be in your notes. Kotobinsky is it, who talks about reification. Aristotle, if you want to go down the route of the third man argument, those kind of things. And then your conclusion is, what is your view? So you're just going to say, what do you think overall? Is this simile accurate about reality? I'll say something more about this at the end. So basically, is Plato right in the way he looks at the world? That is expressed through the. Okay, these are the three perils that I would be writing. I'd do issue one, talk about the theory of the forms. Talk about the arguments for, arguments against, evaluate. Issue two, look at the idea of the form of the good. Arguments for, arguments against, and evaluate. And issue three, look at the role of philosophers. Now, because the question of the cave, I'm just going to put those up again. Because the whole question asks you about the simile of the cave and not just about the theory of forms, there's a particular set of things you've got to do. Before you get into your arguments, you've got to say something about the about this part of the theory and how it's represented in the similes. So, you might begin your pair about the theory of forms by saying, well, some people might say that the simile of the cave does give us a good representation of reality because it represents Plato's theory of forms. Then you've got to say what the forms are, and you've got to say how they're represented in the similes. So that would be, you'd have to talk about the shadows on the wall and the things carried by the people on the path represent the illusory or the non-real nature of the world of appearances, and the things outside the cave represent the forms, the true reality of the forms. What are going to be your arguments for and against? Well, the main argument you're going to use for the forms is the one over many argument that Plato uses. So you take something like goodness or beauty and say, well, there are lots of things that have this thing in common. But none of them are the essence of beauty, so there must be something above all those things that is the essence of beauty that all these things have in common. That is the main argument for the forms. And then there are many, many ways in which you can evaluate. You can put a couple of them in, or you can just do one. I always think the strongest, if you can explain it, is the idea of reification. But you could talk about this idea of, well, that argument from absurdity. Is there a form of every kind of dog, every kind of plant, and so on, all that kind of stuff. You could use Aristotle's third man argument, though I think it's quite a weak argument against the one over many argument, but you could use it. So that's the first peril. Form of the good, I would use this idea of objective moral values. So, one argument for the idea of there needs to be something at least like the form of the good, something that sets moral values, is because without it we end up with moral relativism. And remember, here I'm not talking about moral relativism in the utilitarian sense of the word. I'm talking about complete moral relativism. That's the idea that there is no objective right or wrong. So you got in utilitarianism, moral relativism means what's right or wrong depends on the situation. That's one kind of moral relativism. But a broader kind, or perhaps more significant kind for us, is the idea that there is no right and right and wrong is just a matter of opinion. There's no objective facts about right and wrong. And, a follower of Plato can argue, well, there must be a form of the good. There must be something that links all things that are good, that sets the standard of goodness. Otherwise, we'd end up with no objective right and wrong. Criticism of that could simply be that there is no objective right and wrong, and that yes, it might be desirable. We might want to have an objective right and wrong. We might feel like there should be, but that doesn't mean that there actually is. Role of philosophers, represented in the cave, of course, by the person who returns. It'd be good if you can talk about Socrates there, and say, like, in a way, that person who returns to the cave is both in general a symbol of, like, the idea that philosophers should, once they've understood the world of forms, come back to the world of appearances and guide people, or rule over people. But it's also a representation of the fact that one philosopher who tried to do that, who was Socrates, was misunderstood and mistreated and killed for doing it. So you can include all that stuff in there. Now, why should philosophers rule over society? Well, because Plato says that if you know the form of the good, then you're incapable of doing evil, and therefore, if we want really moral and righteous rulers, then we will employ philosophers as our rulers. How can you criticize this idea? Well, I mean, is it really true that just because someone has knowledge of what's good and evil, that they'll always do good? Probably not. We had that quote from the Bible from St. Paul that we used in a previous lesson about I do not do the good that I want to do, but the evil that I don't want to do. I can't remember the quote exactly, but it's something like that. You can find it in your notes. So yeah, the main argument would be that there's no real, it's not a convincing argument that people who know what's good will never do evil. So those are your perils. That's how to structure it. That's the basic structure of your essay. Again, you don't need to write a full essay. You can if you want. If you want to write full essays, that's fine. but do a plan, a bullet point plan with a full conclusion. Now, I talked about the conclusion. One thing that you might want to put in the conclusion is, well, the thing about Plato's simile is that it's been really popular, even among people who don't actually agree with Plato's theories, because there's something about that simile that catches people's imagination. I mean, on a basic level, the simile is saying that most people in society don't really understand what's going on properly, and that, you know, you need to break away from the normal way in which society works to understand reality, and that kind of has a resonance throughout many ages. You know, it's kind of the basis of Buddhism, that most people are trapped in greed, ignorance, and delusion, and then to really understand the truth, you've got to get away from that. You know, the idea of the cave has come up again and again in like popular culture. Like, there's a famous film, The Matrix, from the 90s, which kind of used that the analogy, the simile of the cave, or used like another set of ideas, a kind of science fiction set of ideas to make the same point. So I suppose what my point would be is that you could say that the simile of the cave, there's something in the simile of the cave that is accurate. Many people would agree that the majority of people do not understand the world clearly. The majority of people in the world are kind of satisfied with a kind of delusional picture of reality, and that in order to really understand reality, it's important to break away from that normal way of looking at the world. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Plato is right about the forms and everything like this. Is my point, is that it might be that basic idea is true, but that the whole theory of forms is a is not right, or it hasn't got very much evidence to back it up. So to make a nuanced conclusion, if you were going to argue against Plato, and I probably think most people will argue against Plato, you could say, you know, there seems to be something in the analogy which has been significant for humanity. There's something about that analogy that is more significant than just Plato's theories. It seems to have a kind of resonance with people. People seem to think that this is in some sense true. But you could say that, so in that sense, maybe it does tell us something about reality if you think that the idea of those ideas resonate with you. But you might say, but the actual theories behind it don't tell us anything about reality. So that might be, if you wanted to, might be a more nuanced way to write your conclusion, if that makes sense. Okay, thank you. Bye.